everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a senior consultation specialist with S&C Lavalin. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So let's get started. Today we're going to do an overview of the baseline studies being undertaken or to be undertaken for the Northern Road Link project to help community members understand the thinking behind and activities associated with this aspect of the project, the baseline study aspect of the project. So let's get started now and look at our first slide. And just to get everyone up to the same level here and provide some background for everyone, I'll just go through what the Northern Road Link is. It's a proposed all-season road in northwestern Ontario, sitting on Treaty 9 land. Um, it will connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the all-season highway network via the proposed Martin Falls Community Access Road, or MFCAR, and it will provide an opportunity for Webquay First Nation to connect to the all-season highway network through their Webquay Supply Road. Um, the project is subject to both Environmental Assessment Act and the Federal Impact Assessment Act. Proponents of the project, so basically the project sponsors, are Martin Falls First Nation and Webquay First Nation. These are both remote Indigenous communities located about 500 kilometers from Thunder Bay. And again, they are not accessible by all season roads. There are only winter roads to these communities, and those roads are closed most of the year. There have been a number of studies done previously on an all-season road to the Ring of Fire, but in 2020, Martin Falls, Webquay, and the province of Ontario announced an agreement to work together where the communities agreed to conduct an environmental assessment for the project funded by the province of Ontario. So where does this project sit in relation to these other two road projects that I mentioned? So it sits in the middle, basically, and these three projects, although they all connect together, they all emerged at different times for different reasons. And the Webquay Supply Road is the road to the furthest north, and then that would connect with the Northern Road Link Road in the Ring of Fire, which then would run down to near Martin Falls, and then the Martin Falls Community Access Road would then connect ultimately with the provincial road network or highway network. And the purpose of it ultimately is to enable economic activity by helping the transport of goods and services and resources. So as we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about project components. So the road itself, as I always say with these kinds of projects, it's not just a two-lane gravel road. So this is an all-season, multi-use gravel road that could range in length, depending on the segment alternatives that are ultimately chosen. It could range between 117 and 164 kilometers in length. The right-of-way is going to be approximately 100 meters in width, and the cleared area would be approximately 60 meters. There are obviously numerous water crossings. One major water crossing, that being of the Attawapiskat River, which would be a crossing of greater than 200 meters. And as with projects like this, there is what you call ancillary infrastructure. So when I say it's not just a road, that's what I'm talking about. And this would be both temporary and permanent infrastructure, including storage and laydown areas, maintenance facilities and yards, access roads such as to get to pits and quarries, the aggregate sites or the pits and quarries themselves, and then of course construction camps to house the workers, which often are twinned with storage and laydown areas. So let's move a little bit to talk about the valued components. And valued components are formally defined as components of the environment identified as important and or sensitive to change, of concern or of value for cultural or traditional purposes, and likely to interact with the project or project activities. So, how do we explain this more simply than that? Well, basically, they're what's important. They're the factors, they're the components that are important to community members. Let's say. Um, so some examples to help illustrate that might be the different categories. So Aboriginal treaty rights and interests. You could be talking about in that you could be talking about the indigenous use of lands and resources, the cultural continuity and well-being of the community as a whole and its members, um, biological environment, and this is more traditionally associated with what people think of when they think of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. So the fish and fish habitat, the wildlife and wildlife habitat, birds and bird habitat, plants and plant communities, and species at risk. And then when we look at physical environment, we could be talking about things like air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, noise, groundwater, surface water, geology, terrain, and soils, and then visual environment. And then we could be talking about human health as well, looking at the health of community members and socioeconomic environment. So things like regional and local economy, community services and infrastructure, land use and recreation, community safety. And then another category is cultural heritage resources. So you could be taught built heritage resources and cultural heritage landscapes. So again, a lot of different and varied components, valued components. And from these valued components, we that sort of sets that drives what studies are done. So you identify what's important, and then the studies come in to look at that in more detail. And we'll move on to the next slide about the Aboriginal and treaty rights and interest studies. So, collecting Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous land and resource use information that might have been compiled previously by communities, and then completing project-specific studies to collect and report on Indigenous knowledge, um, Indigenous land and resource use, cultural values, and Indigenous rights and interests. Um, so there's a lot of effort put on that side of things to collect that Indigenous knowledge information. Next, we'll move to physical environment. There's a lot of physical environment studies. If we can switch slides, and those include things like, and a lot of times community members don't realize like how in depth an environmental assessment or an impact assessment is, and it is very, very in depth. That's why these projects take a long time, because there's a lot of baseline studies that are undertaken, and they're all very different. So under physical environment, some of the studies might be air dispersion modeling, greenhouse gas emissions inventory. That would include like lose the loss of carbon sinks from as a result of the project, climate change assessment, noise impact assessment, groundwater monitoring, um, so quality and quantity through groundwater monitoring wells, surface water sampling or hydrology, as it's looking at movement of water across the surface and flow rates, and looking at bathymetry, depth of water courses, and modeling hydrology, so the movement of surface water in different scenarios, in different situations, looking at depth of peat, to understand, what the subsurface is, so what's under the ground. So if you're building a road, you need to know what's underneath where you're building the road, so you know how to build it in those areas. So, um, Drilling to investigate peat thickness is a really important activity to understand how different sections of the road need to be designed. And then things like visibility mapping and 3D landscape modeling, sort of um, to help community members understand what a crossing, for example, might look like, a culvert pipe or a bridge, what it might look like um, if it were in place, and giving people a real sense, like a real sense of reality, so that they get a really good idea of what it would look like, to see whether it would impact their experience or enjoyment of the land. Let's move now to biological environment studies. There's a number of different types of studies here. There's fish studies, so you could look at um, fish habitat, doing assessments of fish habitat. You could look at what you call eDNA sampling, so where you're taking a sample of all the genetic material in a water sample and then analyzing it to see what's there, to get an idea of what's going on and what's occupying different water courses. Um, Conventional capturing of fish, so putting out nets and capturing fish, and then doing species counts in each catch as well. And then of course benthic invertebrate sampling, and benthic invertebrates are those little bugs that live at the bottom of streams and rivers and lakes, and they're a very good indicator of ecosystem health. And then when we look at wildlife, there's lots of different kinds of studies that are done. Bat hibernacula studies. A hibernacula would be is where bats hibernate. Maternity roost surveys, where pregnant bats would typically hang out during that time that they're pregnant. And then acoustic recording units are used to basically listen for things like bats and birds to understand activity, and in the case of birds, understand what different species maybe are using a particular area, how intensively they might be using an area. And then, of course, there's the habitat field classification to understand areas and whether they'd be suitable for as habitat for different wildlife species. There's winter aerial track distribution surveys where we do aerial surveys to look at and then make observations as to caribou sightings or wolverine sightings, larger mammal sightings and raptor nests and things that can be seen from a helicopter with snow cover on the ground on a bright day. Birds. A lot of bird studies are involved in these kinds of projects. Breeding bird point counts, where observers go to a particular location and count birds and observe and count species as well, or numbers of each species at a particular location. And again, the acoustic recording units, the habitat field classification, looking at waterfowl migration, aerial surveys, doing counts of waterfowl at different places where migrating birds may stop over as well. And then looking at plants, doing vegetation surveys and vegetation mapping to get a better understanding of what plants are where. And then looking at species at risk, we do the aerial surveys. There's caribou collaring, which I'll talk about in a minute, and uh, field or habitat field classifications. And again, ARU surveys, wolverine hair snag and camera trap surveys, which are really interesting, and we'll get into in another presentation. And of course, just what we call opportunistic observations, where if biologists see things, they make note of location, what they saw in detail, that they happen to sort of come upon, because quite often when they're out in the bush, they see things that they maybe didn't expect to see, but all of it's important in terms of collecting information on the baseline, on the way things are now. Let's move next to the next slide, which is on caribou collaring. Um, so when we talk about caribou collaring, I believe there were 14 female caribou that were captured previously, and when they're captured, there's quickly blood samples and hair samples and pellet samples taken from them to get a better understanding about whether they're pregnant or not, and understand whether they've been stressed previously leading up to the capture, and then just their general health. And these collars have GPS units on them so that we can locate um, where the caribou and where they're moving, how they're moving, and just get a better understanding of their behavior. And then these collars come off after no more than 3 years as well too. They fall off automatically. We move on now to the socioeconomic environment related studies. So, in these kinds of studies, we do data collection, regional and local economy, understanding the regional and local economy, understanding um, community services and infrastructure that's available to community members, understanding land use in the area, recreational activities, current recreational activities of community members, and then getting an understanding for community safety or perception of safety in the community. And this kind of work is done through community surveys, through focus groups, in-depth interviews, and publicly available data. And then we also do cultural heritage resource studies, a stage one archaeological assessment, which is essentially a desktop assessment, and cultural heritage studies to get a better understanding of the local community and um, to help identify things that need to be considered when looking at in terms of painting that and creating that baseline for the community. And then finally, human health studies, where we would collect data to understand consumption and harvesting patterns for country foods, which are foods which would be acquired locally through hunting and fishing, for example. Um, and so part of what feeds into these human health studies are the air quality, noise, and surface and groundwater results as well too. And the country foods tissue sampling is done to understand the chemical composition of some of the more frequently consumed species as well. So as we get closer to the end here, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on where we are in the process. And right now, we are into the assessment phase, environmental assessment phase of the environmental assessment process. We moved from the planning phase, and now we're in the assessment phase. So we are now deep into the process, doing the baseline studies and evaluating alternatives as well, too. And if we move to the next slide, we went through in the planning phase. We went through a terms of reference review. So the project team prepared the terms of reference. We received and responded to over 1,000 comments from regulators, Indigenous communities, and other stakeholders on our terms of reference. These were made available for public comment on 2 occasions. Both times, extensions were provided by the government, and and these were recently, well, not that recently, but I guess back in March, I believe it was, we received the notice of approval of the environmental assessment terms of reference on March 3rd. If you look at the next slide, and again, that signaled the end of the planning phase and the beginning of the assessment phase of the environmental assessment process. So as we move to the next slide, after we had our environmental assessment terms of reference approved, we then posted a notice of commencement during the first week of April. Letters were sent to chiefs and councils with offers to meet. And the idea behind this was, of course, to share project information as transparently as possible and update our consultation contact lists as well too. Um, as we move forward now, if we move to the next slide, baseline data collection and identification of alternatives is occurring right now. We're taking in the input on alternatives right now, and we will be over the next few months. We're receiving input on criteria and indicators as well as the baseline information in the Indigenous knowledge and the Indigenous land and resource use to get those key, establish the key project area features and resources um, that are important to communities. And looking a little further ahead on the next slide, future project milestones and activities after round one would be the evaluation of the alternatives, selecting preferred methods, preliminary effects assessment, cumulative effects assessment, and then, of course, as we move further along, the review of the draft environmental assessment report, and then the final report after that. So um, if we move to the next slide, all the time we are doing this, we are at the same time in parallel speaking with community members like yourselves and other interested groups about the project. We have open houses coming up in September in Geraldton and in Thunder Bay. We are conducting virtual community meetings. We are also conducting in-person community meetings. We would like very much to visit your community. If you will have us as your guest, we would love to share with you details of the project. We also, as you can see right now, are doing live streams and radio shows regularly on topics that parallel the environmental assessment process to sort of walk you through the process. And then we'll occasionally talk about different technical topics with special guests as well, too. And as we reach near the end here, I thought I'd give you a little bit of an update on the federal impact assessment process and where we are. Our initial project description has been prepared, submitted, and approved. Detailed project description has done the same. And then we received a letter on May 23rd of this year stating that officially that an impact assessment is required. So that letter came from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. And based on that, we will receive final tailored impact statement guidelines by August 20th of this year as well. So lots of things going on right now, and hopefully that gets you up to date on everything. And now let's do a quick summary on the next slide of where we are and what we've covered today. So we went through the identified valued components. These guide and direct the baseline studies that are to be undertaken. The baseline studies, as I mentioned, fall into the following general categories: Aboriginal Treaty Rights and Interests, or ATRI, physical studies, biological studies, and then human health studies. So lots of things going on right now in this project. We're very busy conducting all kinds of activities. A lot of people are really busy working on this project. So if we move to the next slide, we will be back again in 2 weeks to talk with you about another interesting topic. And I want to encourage you to visit northernroadlink.ca. We hope this was helpful, and we hope it encourages you to join us again in a couple of weeks. And please keep in touch with us and our project team members via the contact information available that you can see on your screen now, and you can also access via northernroadlink.ca. There's lots of information on the project there. There's lots of contact information. We really look forward to meeting with you in your community in particular, but you can tell us how you would like to meet with us, and we'll be happy to follow any protocols that you provide for us. So, miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates on social media and our website, northernroadlink.ca. Miigwech, see you soon.